Hey guys, how's it going? Dudey, I am back with another video. In today's video, we have a case that I discovered through watching I Am a Killer on Netflix. And this case, I mean, it blew my mind, pretty much. And it's quite it's quite an interesting end. So stick around, and I would love to know your thoughts down below. Before we get into the video, if you could like, share, and subscribe by the end of this video, if this video impresses you enough. And if you'd like to go the extra mile, you can become a patron for just £1 a month. Today's patron of the day is Kaylee Egerton. Thank you so much for being a patron. Okay, so the case of Victoria Smith. The murder of Chris Isaac. Voices told her to kill her husband, so she did. Didn't she? Victoria Smith grew up in Poplar Bluff, Missouri. She never knew who her father was, although there were rumors, and her mother even alluded to a few men that it could have been, but it was never for certain. Victoria was one of 8 siblings, but she had a special connection with her younger sister, Betty. It's important to note that Victoria was rather slow growing up, and she had learning difficulties, and now as an adult, her IQ is thought to be below 75, which makes her borderline intellectually disabled. Victoria and her siblings had an incredibly abusive upbringing. She was brought up very poor, and her mother struggled with an alcohol addiction. Now, when her mother was drunk, she would often beat Victoria, and we're not talking, you know, a slap across the bottom or anything like that. We're talking punches, scratches, hair pulling, even kicking. Now, this was not exclusive to Victoria, and when her siblings, especially Betty, was the target of her mother's abuse, Victoria would play up and try and deflect her mother's attention onto her in order to protect Betty. This would occur 2 or 3 times a week, all the way up to when Victoria was 15 years old. At 15 years old, she left home with her older sister to go and live in Louisiana. Just 2 years would pass, and at the age of 17, Victoria would fall pregnant with her son, Kenny. In 1983, Kenny was born, and Victoria was living with Kenny's father, who himself was abusive. It would appear that Victoria could not escape alcoholic abusers. Now, in interviews, Victoria states that Kenny was the apple of her eye, the greatest thing she had ever done, the greatest thing she had ever seen, and the love of her life. However, she was still a young mother, and mistakes were to be made. She was regularly abused by Kenny's father to a point where she had had enough, and after 2 years of abuse, Victoria left with Kenny. Now, her motivations behind leaving was obviously to escape the abuse, but also in the hope that Kenny would have a better upbringing away from abuse. But there is a little bit of poor logic here, because Victoria decided to move back in with her mother, the root of her own abuse. So I don't quite see how A gets to B when you want to escape abuse so that your son can live in an abuseless household, but you go back to your home of abuse. But also, Victoria was a single mother, so maybe she didn't have the options, and the only option available to her was to go back home. She got a job, and while she was working the job, her mother would look after Kenny. So her mother was essentially raising Kenny now. Victoria felt like she was missing out on her youth, and so she would go out as a single lady at the weekends. And she actually developed an alcohol addiction herself. Now, this got worse and worse, and Victoria's mother actually said to her, "You are a terrible mother." And it kept getting worse until an ultimatum was made by Victoria's mother, Kenny's grandmother. The ultimatum was, you can continue to live here, but I want you to sign this piece of paper that gives me parental control over Kenny. And reluctantly, and apparently the most heartbreaking thing that Victoria ever did, she signed the rights of Kenny's parentage over to her own stepmother. This led Victoria to completely fall off the rails. Like, the wheels came off at this point, and her drinking spiraled, and she decided to add pills into the mix. A very lethal concoction. Let's fast forward to the year 2000, and this is where Victoria met Chris Isaac, the man that she would one day murder. He wasn't a drinker, which was a massive change in Victoria's life, and it actually helped her quite a lot. And by all accounts at the time, Chris was an incredibly gentle soul. However, he had an incredibly laborious job, which led to him getting a back injury, which led to him becoming addicted to opioids, and this is when everything changed. Victoria and Chris were married by this point. They actually got married just a year into their relationship. But the opioids changed Chris for the worse, apparently. However, I do want to just say here that Chris's family says that at no point was he an aggressive man. This was all in Victoria's head, and he was just a lovely, sweet, caring individual. But obviously, you have Victoria saying that he was incredibly aggressive, abusive, put her in the hospital several times to a point where she feared for her own life. Then you have the family. Maybe they couldn't see what was going on behind closed doors, or maybe Victoria made this all up. There is no real way to know. So allegedly, according to Victoria, there is a lot of abuse going on once again in her relationship. And we have to fast forward again now to 2012. And Victoria suffers a stroke. Now, Victoria apparently would do the house chores, she would cook, she would clean. But after the stroke, she was unable to do these things as efficiently as she could before. And this would frustrate Chris heavily, which made him even more aggressive. The medications, the stress, and the sleep deprivation was causing Victoria to apparently hallucinate. And one night, whilst in the process of breaking up with Chris, on May the 14th, 2013, Victoria is laying in her bed. She gets up because she fancies a cigarette. So she goes to the kitchen to get a cigarette, but then she starts hearing voices in her head telling her to do things. And she feels like, in that moment, rather than grabbing a cigarette, she should grab a gun. And she should shoot Chris, who is asleep on the sofa. So, Victoria said she shot him 6 times and then 12 times in the head. The prosecutor said 10 times, but let's say between 10 and 12 times, Chris was shot in the face with this pistol. Then, 10 minutes later, Victoria would call the police and confess to murdering her husband. She was arrested, and 3 years later, she was finally sentenced to life in prison, plus 25 years. But did she do it? What do you mean? Did she do it? So remember I said about Betty, Victoria's beloved little sister. Well, Betty, a few counties over, became a deputy sheriff. Went on to become chief of police. So this lady knows how to investigate a murder. And obviously, being her sister, she's looked into the case heavily. And she claims Victoria did not pull the trigger. In fact, the killer was her own nephew, Victoria's son, Kenny. A month before the murder, Kenny moves in with his mother and stepfather. Now, it's important to note because of how Kenny was raised by his grandmother from a very, very young age. Kenny and his mum had a weird relationship, right? In the sense that Kenny viewed Victoria more as his older sister than his mother. Whereas Victoria wanted to be this great mother to him because she knows that she let him down time and time again and was a terrible mother to him growing up. Anyway, he moves in. It doesn't go well. Kenny and Chris have a fight before the murder. Before the murder. Has a fight. Kenny gets a black eye from Chris. Okay? Now, according to Betty, knowing how her mother, Kenny's grandmother, would have raised Kenny to not take shit from anyone, she knew that Kenny would seek revenge for this black eye. How dare you give me a black eye? Who are you to give me a black eye? So Betty believes that Kenny sought to murder Chris in retaliation for the black eye. Now, interestingly, Betty admits there is no evidence to back this up. Okay? But then she goes on to say, and this blew my mind, because like I say, chief of police, you know, deputy sheriff, all that sort of stuff, knows her stuff, yeah? She said, there's no evidence, but then again, if someone has the time to wash and change their clothes, then there's not going to be any. And I was just like, really? Not even like micro stuff? Is it that easy to get away with murder? But I guess it is 99% easier getting away with murder if you literally have someone confessing for you to take the blame. Betty believes that the police were just lazy and just took Victoria's word for it. Oh, well, she said she's murdered him, and so happy days, let's close the case. Was Victoria protecting Kenny? Maybe making amends for her being a bad mother, you know? I'll take the rap for you in penance for not raising you. I mean, it makes sense. Obviously, the Sheriff's Department and the prosecution heavily dispute this, and they actually present evidence because Victoria was covered in blood speckles and blood splatter, which you can't recreate unless you are literally stood in front of someone shooting them in the face, funnily enough. There was even gunshot residue on Victoria where, you know, she's been holding the gun and the residue has come out of the gun and onto her. They also found a piece of paper which was apparently Victoria's will and testament, which makes it look like a potential murder-suicide, but she bottled the suicide element. However, there was a call made to police before the murder from Kenny saying he wants to kill Chris, he wants to kill Victoria, and he wants to kill himself. But of course, this is entirely circumstantial evidence, and there was no physical evidence on Kenny, but there was certainly a motive there in a verbal phone conversation. But prosecution did look at that, but they were just overwhelmed by the evidence stacked on Victoria to pay it any mind, plus the lack of evidence on Kenny. But he was present. He was in the trailer at the time of the murder. I don't know if this hinders Betty's theory, but she wrote a book about it, and you have to question the you know, why are you doing that? What are the intentions behind that? Is it to spread the word of the case, to try and get a retrial, to get more interest drummed up into the case itself? Is it for money? Is it for fame? Is it for attention? But I believe from watching the documentary that genuinely, at the very least, no matter what her motivations were, she does love her sister and she does really want her sister to be free. They are filing a retrial, and really weirdly, they revisited Victoria a few months later after this retrial had been filed, and she's gone from saying, you know, I was kind of in a haze, but I remember shooting him in the face and stuff, to now being like, I don't recall any event that happened because of the medication and the stress, so I have no idea what happened that night. It might have been me, it might have been Kenny. I can't prove it either way. I can't say it either way. So all of a sudden, her recount of that night has changed, and in all honesty, it's up for debate. Did Kenny do it? Did Victoria do it? What do you guys think? You know, it's quite something. I personally think the motivation behind this, and I could be completely wrong, I think Victoria did it. I think she knew that Kenny, she heard about the phone call to police. She knew that Kenny wanted to kill her, Chris, and himself. And in order to save her son's life from taking his own life, as well as hers and Chris's, maybe she said, look, Kenny, I will kill Chris. Don't take your own life. I will go to prison for the rest of my life as penance for being a terrible mother to you. He's abusive to me. I will kill him for you, for us, so we can all be free. I don't know. Yeah, something along those lines. I feel like the phone call is important. I do feel like the fact that Kenny was whether he was mentally stable or not, the fact that he was at a stage where he was like, I'm going to kill them both and I'm going to kill myself. I feel like a mother would do anything to save their child, even kill their husband, to stop Kenny from doing it and then taking his own life. Maybe she intended to take her own life afterwards, but just thought, you know what, I'd rather go to jail. I don't know. But that's just I'm not saying I'm right. That's just a theory that I have. But I do think that Victoria did it because the blood spatter is too much. You know, the evidence on her is too much. But did they just stage it all? You know, and was it Kenny and he cleaned up? What do you guys think? Let me know down below. But it was a fantastic episode of this series, and I highly recommend that you go and check it out. I'll probably be doing more videos from this series because the cases are fascinating. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you really enjoyed it because I really enjoyed researching this one. It was a lot of fun. And yeah, if you want to become a patron to support this kind of content, then you can do that for as little as £1 a month, but you don't have to do that. The main thing is that you come back and you watch and you like and you subscribe. That's all I ask. That is all I ask, and that is all free. Thank you so much, guys. There is a lot of bonus content on the Patreon, though, if that does interest you. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Sweet one. Geese.